Hello and good afternoon. I am Nathaniel Moore, and this is the first episode of Out of Place but Effective. In this episode, we will be going over each country that I will be placing, and going over what their staple tank was and what they wanted out of a tank. During the war, these nations each fought and had different variations of their fighting and the different abilities with their vehicles. The Germans favored blitzkrieg in the beginning, but had to slowly switch to attrition due to lack of resources and lack of many other things. One of their main staples was the Panzer IV and Panzer III vehicles. Each of these vehicles were highly upgradable and highly had the ability to be versatile and change the needed scenario. During the late war, they were equipped to be more defensive than offensive because they were being pushed back on both fronts, so they needed to have the ability to have defensive smoke as well as still be offensive. As we can see from this Panzer IIIM, one of the later variants of the Panzer IIIs, it has spaced armor on the turret to defend against heat rounds and slow rounds down, a long barrel 5cm gun or 50mm gun, extra plating on the front, and you have wider tracks which can be replaced for side armor, as we see down here in the little picture. But we're losing those wider tracks and some track armor on the front. Generally, these vehicles could be swapped out. These things could be swapped out for a shorter gun, no plating, because we have other vehicles like the Panzer IV-C, having a short barrel 75, or the Panzer III-F, having a short barrel and less side armor and no defensive tracks. These were the main staples of the German army in the early years of the war. The Panzer IV survived longer than the Panzer III. Most Panzer III companies were hard to find because they'd been ruined so much due to the Africa War and the Russian counterattack in the east. We also have vehicles like the Stug, which gave it the ability to be changed from a turreted vehicle to a non-turreted vehicle. A lot of these vehicles gave way to later ones. And while the switch from the Panzer IVs being the main staple to the Tiger is mostly due to people overhyping the Tiger because big tank cool. A lot of the time the Tiger was less favored to the Panzer IV. You could get more Panzer IVs were built than Tigers, but Tigers still got the job better done housing that long barrel 88. And the Panther, well, it's a Panther. It was mainly used on the Eastern Front. We saw a few of them as the Americans and British, but generally the Russians were finding them. When we did see them, they were more than likely being transported. But the Tiger has two different variants of the Tiger I, being the Tiger H and the Tiger E. The H lacks a turret-mounted penal machine gun, while the E does have that turret-mounted penal machine gun. We are also using Warhammer. I should have mentioned this earlier, but War Thunder will be how I'm showing you these vehicles and giving you the ability to see them of the ones that I can show you. But these two different vehicles kind of showed what they needed, because they wanted this ability to move fast at the beginning of the war with the Panzer IVs and Panzer IIIs, and then they switched to the slower ones where these could be defensive, you see by smoke. While this one doesn't have smoke deployers, it does have a smoke launcher inside of the vehicle, which can launch a single smoke grenade out the top. This was featured in the Panther and other vehicles as well. What it would look like is, see this hole right here? That's where smoke would be launched out of the roof and land in front of them, giving them the ability to be covered. Some earlier German vehicles would have it placed on the rear of their vehicle, where it would simply just drop down, giving it more defensive smoke. But moving on, next up we have America. America, their main staple was the M4 Sherman. The M4 Sherman is a very effective vehicle. Their strategy for most of the war, well, all of the war, was combined arms. Infantry with tanks, mostly doing charges, under tank support, with multiple different vehicles. The Americans used the M3 Stuart, the M5 Stuart, the M2 Stuart, and the M3 Lee. Because we have all of these here. The M2 housing a whole bunch of 30 cals. As you can see by there being five, one on top, two on the sides, and one on the gunner and one mounted wholly. It's kind of being covered by that light, but it's there. The M3 still had four of them, but no, still didn't need that many. And the M3 EA1 knocked them all out down to the two new. The M5 was still at using three, because there's one hull mounted. But as you can see, most of these vehicles, besides the Lee, have a turret-mounted penal machine gun. This allowed them to have better engagement of enemy infantry, because most American vehicles liked that 50 cal or machine gun, giving them the ability to engage enemy infantry with a machine gun instead of their main cannon, and save those main cannons for infantry carriers or some kind of transport. These 50 cals allowed them to do many things. I think one of the best scenes with the 50 cal is in the show Band of Brothers, when you see them moving up on a 75 Sherman. I don't want to do that. Sherman, and they're standing on the back using the 50 cal. I'm looking for, there we go. They would basically stand on this little plate right here, and do it. Because most of the time you think the 50 cal or penal mounted machine gun would be used by the commander. But as you can tell, that's the commander's hatch right there. Kind of hard for him to use that 50 cal unless he's shooting to the rear of him. But an infantryman could go stand and on the back of the vehicle above the engine well and engage enemy infantry to a very good extent while keeping the crew inside of the vehicle safe. Generally, there were other variants of the Sherman. You have the T-34 Calliope being one of the many, many rocket variants, as well as the M4A3E2, seen near the end of the war, being the Jumbo. Generally, the 75 variant was the only one deployed until after the war, when a few 76 Jumbos made it to the front lines. But they were mostly shown off in Berlin and given to be used by American troops in Berlin just to show off. But a lot of the 76 variants were untrusted by crews and not really needed. While the 76 was needed, generally they could have done what the British did and just add one to a platoon and go from there. But just to give you a quick look, this is the inside of a Sherman. As you can see, it's actually pretty little bit roomy in there. Of course, they're not showing the sheets or what they're standing on, but it's still giving you an example of what it looks like. Because there's some decent space between each people besides the commander and the loader. Because that's actually commander and gunner, and that's the loader. And there's your commander. But moving on, we have the Russians. The Russian main staple was the T-34, as we know from many hyped up things. The T-34 was effective at doing long range and doing Russian deep battle doctrine. This deep battle doctrine was generally skewed into a massive combined arms and blitzkrieg maneuver, where they would use massive lines, tanks would punch through through enemy lines and go around and put pressure on from all sides of an enemy unit. The best example I know of is Company of Heroes 2. One of their missions, as you play as the Russians, you encircled a German town. In this German town, well, it's a German occupied town, but as you're encircling it, they're trying to escape. They're trying to fall back to their own lines. But you fully encircled them. The only way they can go to their lines is through you. And it's a hard mission to do, but it shows that deep battle worked. Inside of a T-34, as you got a quick look a minute ago, the driver and machine gunner are kind of cramped. This driver also had the job of being the radio man, slightly, as well as the gunner and commander were tightly packed, and the commander was also doing a loader job, making it very difficult for him to do the true job of a commander, which is spot targets, call ranges, and give commands. So it was mostly up to the gunner to do that job. The T-34 was developed as something to give the Russian army the ability to do this. They did have other vehicles. Early war, you see much of the T-series, these T-60s, T-40s, T-50s used to engage the enemy. We also see the American-bought BT series tanks, which were transported over and made by Chrysler, but Chrysler sold them to the Russians. And you also see the T-28s, T-26s, and SU series make their way throughout the war. The last T-series was the T-80, 80 of their light tanks, which was very effective and actually upgraded from a 45 to a 57 at one point, but did not see much use after that. Generally, though, these tanks were meant for infantry support, nothing else. But they used the T-34 as much as they could, giving it the ability to be long range and upgradable as needed. There were a few variants built with steel wheels on the front to be mine clearers. Moving on, we have the British. The British tactics were as follows. Infantry and cruiser tanks. Infantry tanks were generally prescribed as something following the Churchill series. The Churchill series were generally heavy vehicles with a lot of armor that were slow enough to move with infantry, while at the same time engaging other armor or light armor at closer ranges due to their low velocity 75mm gun or long barrel, short barrel 6-pounder gun, which was a 57mm gun. We also have vehicles that were the cruiser tanks being Cromwell tanks, Crusaders, or cruiser vehicles as earlier in the war. These vehicles generally were meant to be speedy, fast, maneuver around enemy tanks and engage. Like, it's 52 kilometers an hour, giving it massive speed compared to the 20 kilometers of a Churchill. The general strategy was infantry tanks would work with infantry closely, while cruiser tanks would be out of sight, out of mind, until engaging enemy armor and maneuvering around to the side and rear with vehicles taking them out. Generally, this was not a well-used tactic. This was a well-used tactic, actually, but it worked efficiently and showed people what it could do. These vehicles generally were only equipped with solid shot, lacking the ability to shoot their man cannons at enemy infantry, but the machine guns more than made up for it. Each of these vehicles were heavily modifiable. At late war, the Cromwell actually got its frontal armor armored up from a Cromwell 5 to a Cromwell 7, and the Churchill was given several different models. One of their turrets even housing an American 75mm gun, being the M3 gun, as well as a Churchill Crocodile, which gave it flamethrower capabilities. Our final group is the Japanese. The Japanese preferred infantry tactics over everything. This is shown off by the amount of machine guns a Japanese vehicle could carry. You have the one on the front, as you saw, the one on the rear, and the one on the turret. These 3 machine guns, while having less capacity than any other vehicle on the field, it still did their job. Gave them the ability to maneuver and fire and engage infantry, which is more than often what they were seeing. Yes, later in the war they did see Shermans, but a lot of the time those Shermans didn't make it to the beach, and the ones that did, well, one tank is one tank. And when you can easily throw people at it, as the Japanese sometimes did, to take out vehicles, they would. But they needed tanks that were light, easy to be transported, and very fast, and can maneuver in mountainous terrain. As we see, this is only 14 tons compared to a American Sherman, which came in at 30 tons. That's a big difference. But that allowed them to be easily transported and more transported than the Sherman. Generally, these vehicles had shorter barrel guns that would allow them to fire heat rounds, or some kind of round that were easily taking out enemy vehicles. And generally, while the strategy was meant for infantry tactics, and if you got ahead of your infantry you would slow down and fall back, most Japanese tankers did not follow this and would be overly aggressive with their tanks. While before the American time this was a good idea and could be sustained slightly, once America got into the war, this over-aggressiveness kind of stabbed them in the back. But to give a quick review, for Germany, it's blitzkrieg, from blitzkrieg to attrition, wanting something that can deal with what's being thrown at them while still being decently maneuverable and decently fast. And then America, they wanted combined arms, the ability to engage enemy armor and infantry at the same time with the availability of air support. Russians, huge combined arms blitzkrieg tactics, giving the ability to engage enemy armor and infantry at the same time. For Great Britain, cruiser and infantry tanks, the ability to engage them with both while working with infantry and cause chaos by flanking maneuvers. With the Japanese using these infantry tactics to work and maneuver around enemy infantry and just suppress them while their tanks move up with infantry support. Thank you, and this is the first episode of Out of Place But Effective.